Good morning, and I'm glad that you're all here. And I hope by the end of the session you'll be here. Can everybody hear me? You know, I don't project very well. There's a lot of things I don't do very well. Projecting is so can you hear me in the back? If I get too soft, just say, hey, can't hear you. So as far as a bio, I'm a physician, but more importantly, I'm a husband and father of 4 and a grandfather of 2. I'm actually retired from the U.S. Public Health Service. I spent 26 plus years in uniform, spent all of that time except for a couple of deployments in the Indian Health Service. So I served people in Rosebud, South Dakota, then Cherokee, North Carolina, with Eastern Family Cherokee. Then I was at the Nashville area office for several years, and I also served for a year up in Montana in the buildings. And I did a couple other temporary things here and there. But anyway, that was sort of my career. I now have 2 part-time jobs. My children tell me, especially my mother tells me, I'm not doing this retirement thing very well. Failure of retirement. So I work part-time for the Eastern Band Cherokee as a hospitalist. I take care of inpatients. And then my other part-time job is with USET as a medical epidemiologist. I may be the only hospitalist epidemiologist in the country. It's kind of a strange combination. Works for me. Anyway, what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of the history of the current substance use epidemic in America. This isn't the first time we've had a drug epidemic. We've had several in the past. You know, I kind of debated in my mind, is this a worthwhile talk to give? Because I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of lists of things of how we can solve all this, although I am going to talk a little bit about that. But I think it's really important to know about history sometimes. You know, there's a saying that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Yeah. Well, I think this is a really good example. But anyway, by the end of this presentation, I hope you can be somewhat familiar with the extent of the problem. I think you're probably already familiar with the extent of the problem, but also I want you to be familiar with kind of how we got to where we are today. This has happened over the last 30, 35 years. Just about 2 months ago, passed my 40th anniversary of seeing patients. So I've been seeing patients now for 4 decades, and I've watched this whole thing develop over my career. So, and then I want you to be able to list at least a few of both the medical complications as well as the psychosocial complications, substance use disorder. Some disclaimers, and I don't have any financial interest. I am a paid employee of USET, and I'm a contracted employee of Cherokee Indian Hospital Authority. Views I'm expressing are my own, they're not, you know, the people I work for have nothing to do with it. Thank you, Christy. Yeah. Christy's my boss.
I agree with everything he says.
So far.
I
So I've got my boss and my boss's boss. No pressure. Also, I want you to understand that what I'm going to say this morning is heavily influenced by my own experience. Okay? So I'm not going to give you a whole lot of facts and figures, but I am going to tell you about my journey with this whole problem. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. I'm going to start with a patient's story, and I'm going to tell you a doctor's story. After that, I'm going to give you the history lesson. And at the end, I just want to end with some reflections on what I've observed and maybe how we can move out of this bad situation that we're in as a nation. But let's start with pretest. This is fun, but so the United States has a little over 4% of its population. As of 2022, we had 4.126%. It's about 1 out of 25 people on the planet live in the United States. But how much of the world's opiate supply do you think we consume in the United States? Is it 5%, 12%, 30%, 55%, or 80%? 80? You think 80? Are you kidding?
No.
30? 30?
I would say at least 55%.
Yeah, it's 55% too.
You are correct. You went to it's 80%. When I tell the general lay public this, they don't believe it. They're like, no, I can't possibly do it. It's well documented. See, I even have the reference. All right. Oh, by the way, how much of the world's supply of hydro? Who knows?
More.
It's more than 80%.
Yes, it is.
We consume 99%. Nobody else in the world uses it because it's not that great. It's great. So again, we have 4% of the world population. What supply of the world's illicit drugs? I'm not talking about prescription drugs. I'm talking about heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, stuff that the doctor doesn't write up. So is it, a tenth, a third, half, 2/3? Or is it that 80%? You're going with 80. All right, 80. Do I hear another number? 50? 2/3. You, sir, win the prize. So, other countries have a prize. But when you think about the fact that we've only got 1/25 world population, but we're doing 2/3 of the world's, does that tell you anything? It is. There are a lot of problems related to this. The whole immigration issue in America, or I should say, we used to call it illegal immigration issue. It is very much driven by this. In 2014, I was deployed by the U.S. Public Health Service down to the border in Arizona, where hundreds of children were coming across the border. These were kids mostly between the ages of 12 and 17. They were fleeing 3 countries. It wasn't Mexico, it wasn't Panama, it was Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Those 3 countries accounted for like 98% of the countries. Why? It's because those countries have terrible violence and there's basically law enforcement. It's all run by drug gangs. Why are those drug gangs in those countries? Because they are involved in transporting illegal drugs to the United States. That's the whole big reason. So tell that to your folks. All right, I said I would tell you a couple of stories. So I'm going to start off. This is a real person, and everything I'm going to tell you was told to me by this person. It's not really a patient of mine, although he did seek me out for help. It's actually a family. But anyway, when he was 18 years old, back in the early 80s, he had a pulled muscle in his back. And an older friend said, hey, take one of these and help you back. It was Tylenol number 3, which most of us think of as, that's nothing. Codeine, though, in vivo, in your body, turns into morphine. So codeine's not an innocuous kind of drug. Anyway, he really liked it. So he asked his friend if he could get a little more of that. His friend said, I think you might like it too much, so no. But over the next few years, he would, go to the doctor for various things. And he'd ask for, Tylenol 3 or some vitamins. I'll give you a few. He always would save it to use it recreation because he liked the way it made him feel. And it wasn't just the euphoria. He found that it really made him more optimistic, made him feel like he could take on the world. But he thought if he could take enough of this stuff, man, he could move. Those were his words. That's how he described it. So for a good 15 years or so, he just kind of used it recreational. Something happened when he turned in his early 30s, and he really couldn't say what he was, but suddenly his use escalated. He did say there were some things that contributed. He had struck out on his own businessman. He was really, under a lot of pressure. And he really felt like this helped him deal with that pressure. So he found himself taking more. And hydrocodone, which, we think of oxycodone as being a bad one. But he said he really preferred hydrocodone to oxycodone because it had a faster onset of action. Is that true, Robert? I don't know. But anyway, that's what he said. Robin's a pharmacist. And no, Robin. She's a wonderful. Anyway, he realized that he was developing a problem. He knew he had a problem. So occasionally he would detox himself. And he tried to stop, but he always went back. So then for about 5 years, he said, I tried every day, but I just couldn't. He detoxed himself a bunch of times, but he said he never lasted for more. He'd go back to peace. So this was actually the point that it came to me. And I had known him since he was a very young man. And I was actually shocked. I had never seen the signs. And I'm a physician. His wife was using, let alone using. So he was really, he's very smart. So he was good at keeping it a secret. But he came to me and said, I've got to do something about this. It's wrecking my life. He said, is there anything I can do besides go get help? And I said, no, you need to get help. You got to get. So he went to an outpatient treatment program. It was, multiple weeks, got involved with the 12-step program. And then he really got into exercise. And he really liked a long-distance run. I'm not surprised by that. Because what happens when you put in for a long time? You get endorphins. So he was still feeding those receptors, but in a much. So this worked for him for a long time. He wasn't so hot on the 12-step program because he, despite his intelligence, his many abilities, he doesn't do well in groups. So the group thing just wasn't for him. But he went because he knew it was important to get it sober. But it was really the exercise and the self-discipline that helped him the most. Now he thought, because he had such good self-discipline now, well, alcohol would hurt. So he started drinking, which after about 10 years of being completely off the hydrocodone, I really think the alcohol greatly contributed to this, but he went back to music. One day, he, decided to take a pill, and within a few weeks, it was more than Philadelphia. He was back. He's really happy. He found some places where he could get large amounts. Now, you know, when you think about you're taking Vicodin or Vortex, which is acetaminophen with hydrocodone, think about what that's doing to your liver. I mean, he thinks that he was just really, really fortunate to not kill his liver. I think it's anyway, he was addicted again, physically and mentally. You know, every time he tried to stop, he would go into the well, by this time, Suboxone. So he tried it for 3 months. He said it was a miracle. He said for him, this changed his life. So he was able to get it, you know, get off of the hydrocodone by taking it. And he managed to stay off, and eventually he stopped the buprenorphine. He managed to stay clean for 5 months. Went back to using relapse. So after, you know, being addicted again, heavily using, he went on buprenorphine. This time he stayed on it for 6 months. Started going to NA again. And then he got off the buprenorphine. Now, he told me that detoxing from buprenorphine was not a walk in the park. He said it wasn't nearly as bad, wasn't as intense, but it lasts 3 weeks long. Instead of lasting for a week, it's a good 3 weeks. But anyway, I'm happy to say that for the last, it's like 12 years now, it's been a success. I just, does that story like sound familiar to anybody? So, you know, some of you, probably many of us, have found patients.
Yeah, part of this was this story. Because a big part of those
Well,
patients do not make it.
he's successful to now. He knows that every day there's a danger that he could get back. Yeah, lucky. Stronger, yes. So now I want to tell you a doctor story. So this doctor back in the mid-80s as an intern, some of his older mentors who were in their 40s and 50s and 60s, they taught him you should never ever use opiates for chronic non-malignant pain for 2 reasons. One is they don't work, you know. They seem like they work at first. They'll work for a week, but after that, people develop tolerance, you have to do more, keep increasing it. They don't work long term, so just don't do it. Secondly, you do it, you're going to regret it because you're going to cause problems. You're going to cause either the patient to get addicted or you're going to cause them to, you know, start diverting medicine. It's just a bad idea. So don't do it. So that's what the doctor was taught. Now he was taught to use opiates for terminal cancer care. You know, people who were at the end of life and in pain. And the doctor was quite comfortable. So were his mentors. So it wasn't that he didn't use opiates. He just didn't use them for chronic pain. So, you know, he practiced for about 15 years, having a reputation for being a bit of a hard ass. Because he just said no to people. No, not what you need. But sometime around the turn of the century, things started to change. There were actually a couple of things happened. In 1998, this physician experienced some pretty serious pain himself. He had a ruptured cervical disc that caused really bad radiculopathy. Spent about a month not being able to sleep, and he finally had surgery. But it gave him an appreciation for people that dealt with really severe neuropathic pain. But the other thing that changed was that common wisdom that he had learned in 1985 to not use opiates for chronic non-malignant pain. That changed. And I'll say a little more about it as we go on. But anyway, the doctor started to change his practice. He started giving people with chronic non-malignant pain opiates because his colleagues were also changing their practice. They were doing the same thing. And the common wisdom began to be more is better. If your patient has pain, you need to treat their pain. I don't disagree that we need to treat pain. But the tool that everybody was pushing were prescription opiates, hydrocodone, oxygen, all of that. But the doctor noticed something. The clinic patients started to be different. All of a sudden, people were coming out of the woodwork saying, I've got this terrible back pain, I've got this terrible knee pain, I've got this pain all day long. And the doctor started getting kind of uncomfortable. So about 5 years went by. So now we're up to about 2005. And all of a sudden, in the community, there started to be overdose studies. And some of these, well, actually, so this doctor happened to be a medical examiner for a reservation. And within about an 18-month span, there were 11 overdose deaths, some of which weren't figured out to be overdoses until the toxicology came back. Out of these 11 patients, only one had been prescribed opiates. All the rest were getting them illicit. So there got to be more and more aberrant patients. It really started being a problem. There was also a lot of dissension among the medical staff. Some people were saying, you know, we used to say it was a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea. Others were saying, but these people have pain. We have to help them. And they were both right, you know. But everybody was frustrated by this. Patients were the doctors. And this particular doctor became pretty cynical and really didn't want to see certain patients. So by 2006, things really just felt out of control. The staff knew that there was a lot of diversion going on in the community. You know, we had those overdose deaths. So there was a safe medication use committee established. And then there really got to be up here because the medical staff started taking people off of it and saying, you can no longer get opiates from our facility. But the overdose deaths continued. But the doctor had come back to his original, teaching. He realized that using opiates for chronic non-malignant pain was just in general not a good idea. And even short-term use was maybe not a good idea. Remember the patient? First time ever tried codeine, and he knew he liked it. Okay, I'm going to be a little self-revealing here. You already know the doctor's name, right? That's not the self-revealing part. The other self-revealing part is I'm an opiate. At least I think I am. When I was a college student, I got a corneal abrasion. I went to the emergency room because I thought my eyeball was going to fall out. They gave me 2 Tylenol number 3s. And that was the first time I ever had one. I loved it. When I had that ruptured cervical disc in my neck, that was the second time I ever had opiates. They gave me Percocet post-op. And by the 3rd day, I was checking my watch. When was the next dose? It made everything warm and fuzzy. By the 5th post-op day, I had the worst. I thought I had been constipated before, but I hadn't been. I had such. Okay, this is really too much information. I spent a miserable afternoon on day 5, and I said, you know what's causing this? I gotta stop this. So I threw the rest of it. And I've never had another opiate because I think my brain is wired up to easily be addicted to this. It's just like, wow. Some people are. All right. So do those stories sound familiar? Do they resonate? Yeah. So this is the history lesson part. How did we get here? How am I doing on time? Yeah, I do that. When we finish it, okay,
Yeah, half
all
hour.
right, we're doing it.
Sorry.
So how did we get? So this it wasn't any one thing. It was the culmination of many events. All the way back in 1987, that would have been 6 years ago, the Institute of Medicine published a book on pain and disability. And they were very critical in this publication of pain management in America. They said, we got all these people with pain and we're not doing a very good job. A couple of years later, Dr. Mitchell Max wrote an editorial in a very prestigious journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine. And he criticized the lack of improvement in pain treatment over the past 2 decades. So he's talking about, you know, since 1970, we've really not come up with any new ways to treat pain. And we have a lot of people who have chronic painful conditions. And I think we need to acknowledge that we have a lot of people with chronic painful conditions. We do. That's just a fact of life. Apparently in America, we have a lot more than in the rest of the world, given the use of opiates. Anyway, I think this may have been, I mean, if you want to point to any one of them, in 1995, Purdue Pharmaceuticals came out with OxyContin. And it was heavily marketed. And it was often pushed as being very, very low addiction. This is sustained release, so people don't get a high from it. You know, this isn't going to be a drug use. It's okay to use. Anyway, 2000 comes along. The Joint Commission issues a bunch of standards for pain assessment and management of infections. So that wasn't inappropriate, but it kind of made everybody feel like, oh, gee, we got to do that. You know, what's your pain? Is it a 9? Is it a 2? And oh, it's an 8. We got to give you some opiates. And then the VA that same year released the publication Pain is the Good Life Sign. You know, so there were a lot of different things coming together. But I think it was really, I mean, okay, I'm a medical professional, and I think I have to take responsibility for the fact that my profession is addicted to opiates. We did. But I want to say we were being dupes of the pharmaceutical company. There's a really good book. I think it's called Poisoning America. And it's basically about the opiate epidemic and how pharmaceutical companies, they really conspired to push opiate medications on doctors. They sponsored these weekend, you know, how to manage pain kind of conferences. And if you look, every single one of those was sponsored by a company that made opiates. There was this off-cited study. I don't know if any of you remember, but I heard this over and over around the year 2000. Studies have shown that if used for pain, only 4 out of 1,000 people will become addicted. Okay, that's a risk, but it's a real one. This study got cited. It actually got cited more than 500 times in the medical literature. I recently found out, I read this study, read every bit of it. It's 5 sentences. It was a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. It was 5 sentences long. And it said, we looked at the charts of over 11,000 patients who were hospitalized, who were given opiates in the hospital. And then we looked further and only 4 of them had an addiction problem that we could find in the medical records. Now, is that a real study? Did they tell what their methods were? Did they give any statistical analysis? That study got cited over 500 times in the medical literature. And it was only cited starting out. I mean, there were a couple of citations prior to 1995. In 1995, when Oxycontin came out, the citations of that study skyrocketed, especially by the pharmaceutical. Now, what's really, really interesting to me is, any of you epidemiologists in here detected a mistake? 11,000 patients, 4 with addiction. That's not 0.4%, it's 0.04%. It was 4 out of 10,000, 11,000, not 4 out of 1,000. I think that was intentional. Because nobody would believe 4 out of 10,000. 4 out of 1,000, I'm not sure I believe that either. But okay. I think it's more like 40 out of 100. But anyway, that's what happened. So go to the next slide. We have a little graph here. These are opioid deaths from 1999 to 2009. So over a 10-year period, these are deaths due to prescription opiates. These are pills, okay? This isn't injection drug abuse. But from 99 to 2009, these are sales of opiates. These are deaths from overdose. Pretty correlated. These are people going into treatment. So that's you know, we're up to what? That's 13, 14 years ago now. So then what? So by about 2010, it started being pretty widely recognized that we had a problem with prescription drug use. Between 97 and 2006, average sales increased 347%. Did pain go up 347% in that time period? No. But the marketing and the sort of mainstream normalization of taking opiates for chronic non-malignant pain led to that kind of increase. I couldn't find a good statistic for this, but drug use in high schools anecdotally is greatly increased. My 2 oldest children, my daughters, were in high school during this time period, and I learned from them about the drug use in high school. You think about that. I mean, what age is it? You're talking about 14 to 18-year-olds. They are very, very vulnerable to becoming addicted. So there were pill mills. Not to pick on Florida, but Florida was the #1 state for pill mills. And there were all these people who were going from all over the East Coast down to Florida. All you had to do, these pill mills, they call them that because they had a doctor, go in and see the doctor, you tell the doctor which part of you hurt. They write you a prescription for huge, huge amounts of whatever you told them you wanted. And then right next door, they were operating a pharmacy that was dispensing this stuff by truckload. Then they would haul it up the East Coast to wherever they lived, and they would distribute. This went on for a while. But really, by about 2010, this was recognized nationally as a problem, and that pendulum that had swung so far to the just give more started to swing back. But the genie was out of the bottle. The Frankenstein monster had been created. So again, this is what happened from 1991 to 2013. That is millions of prescriptions for opiates. So in 91, we had 76 million prescriptions. But by 2010, it's 219 million prescriptions written for opiates. But you can see where it peaked. It was 2011. And by that time, there were some things. We go to the next slide. Look at the national response. The White House Office of National Drug Control Policy put out a national drug control strategy in May of 2010. About a year later, there was a big plan that was released that outlined several components of how we can fight this problem. And also by May of 2011, 48 out of 50 states had passed legislation that established prescription drug monitoring. That's now in place. So that all happened, you know, good 10, 12 years ago. But what about the Indian Health Service? Well, it was a problem for us, just like it was everywhere else. Back in 2012, I was part of the National Council of Chief Medical Officers. I was the Chief Medical Officer for the Nashville area. And we went to the IHS director and said, we really need to do something about it. It's killing our people, it's destroying our communities. So that summer, the director convened a work group that was supposed to come up with a plan to address prescription drug abuse. And the workforce focused on a number of areas, including one that required training. If you were in the Indian Health Service back then, you may remember you had to take this 6-hour course that had to do with prescription drug abuse and how to manage chronic pain. We were, by the way, the first federal agency to require it. That work group evolved and it's still around today. It's now the Hope Committee. Is anybody familiar with the Hope Committee? Robin is. Okay, if you go to the IHS website and just then the search Hope Committee, they have a lot of good resources and I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's more into not prescription drugs, but heroin, opioids, and pain medics. Because of what happened. So as the medical profession came to recognize we were just being shills for the pharmaceutical companies, and healthcare systems said, you know, this is a problem, prescribing of opioid pills started to go down. But the problem was we had created millions of people who were physically and psychologically addicted. So all of a sudden, you started to see this rise in illicit. So instead of hydrocodone, oxycodone, we started seeing heroin. Heroin was a big problem when I was a child back in the 60s. We had a heroin epidemic in this country back in the 60s, early 70s. It actually led to the Drug Enforcement Act that established the DEA. Believe it or not, there were no schedules prior to 1970. That all came about because of the epidemic that occurred starting in the late 50s through the 60s. So heroin and a whole bunch of others. So actually the use of heroin went way down in this country in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, early 2000s, but it started coming back. So that brought another problem. You know, if people were just popping pills, they weren't injected. Injection drug use skyrocketed, you know, starting late first decade of 21st century. So a whole bunch of new problems come up, and that's what we're facing today. It's what I see every time I work in hospital. So, you know, those last slides were the first decade of the 21st century. This is the second decade of the century. And These are overdose deaths. Deaths per 100,000. This line, this is the pill line. So we can see that, it's been relatively flat. People are still overdosing with oxycodone, but that has kind of stayed flat, maybe is trending downward. Stimulants, these two lines are stimulants. Those are on the rise. People are rejecting. But look at this line. Oh, by the way, this is heroin. So it rose steadily, from 2013. It's kind of plateaued because this line took off. This is 50. So, heroin is actually a natural substance. It's made from opium poppies. It has to be extracted. There's kind of a long process to do it. Fentanyl can be made in a lab. You take some raw chemicals, do some things, and you get fentanyl. It's much, much cheaper, and it's much easier to transport under the radar. To get heroin, you have to grow opium poppies. Those don't grow everywhere. And you've got to harvest them. You've got to extract opium and turn it into heroin. But fentanyl, you can make in any chemistry. Not quite with the chemistry stuff that I got when I was 10 on Christmas. But almost. If you get the raw ingredients and you have a chemist, you can do it. And it's much cheaper and it's a lot easier to transport under the radar. All right, so this isn't the finish of the talk, but we're getting there. I did say I wanted you to be able to name 3 medical complications, 3 psychosocial complications. So this is what I see all the time now in my practice. About half of the patients that I have on inpatient at any given time are there as a consequence of IV drugs. So I see hepatitis C. Almost everybody in my population who injects drugs is hepatitis C positive. We're not seeing a lot of hepatitis B, but they are in some places. We also don't see a lot of HIV, but they do in some places. But sexually transmitted infections occur a lot for a lot of different reasons. I could go into that, but I'll leave that up to your imagination. How that happens. Bacteremia and sepsis is really common, but Bruni's shaking her head because her husband is one of my colleagues at Cherokee who works in the emergency. He's the one that calls me and says, I got a patient. Endocarditis. I used to never see this. Never, ever saw endocarditis. Now I see it all. See abscesses all the time. Cellulitis from injecting is very common. See a lot of osteomyelitis and septic arthritis. So all of these things are very serious conditions. They can pretty much all kill you. And it's all a consequence of IV drug use. But I think the even bigger problems fall into the psychological and social. One of the saddest things about substance use disorder is it causes terrible family disruption. I don't think I have to tell you guys this if you work in healthcare at all, or even if you don't work. If you have a family member who's, using alcohol, using drugs, abusing drugs, it causes problems. It causes problems with relationships. Hard to keep a job when you're using, or maybe not even so heavily, but if you're using, it's hard to keep a job. I mean, some places require drug tests. The drug test comes up positive, guess what? You just got fired. Now you've got to, that's on your record. But, it's hard to get out of bed hungover. You're still high from what you used the night before. Homelessness is this is like endocarditis. I never used to see endocarditis. I also never used to see homelessness on the reservation. You know, culturally, Indian people take care of their own. You know, even if you're, you know, you got problems, usually the family's going to take you in. And they're going to take care of you. They're going to provide you with the roof over your head. They're going to provide you with meals. Until your behavior gets so horrible. And there are little kids in the house. And they finally say, look, we love you, but you can't stay here. And then where, you know, they go to some other relative. Same thing happens. Same thing happens. Eventually, they don't have anybody who take them. And that's so sad. You know, causes crime. How do people afford these drugs, especially if you're unemployed? How do you afford it? That's one of the reasons there are a lot of sexually transmitted infections. People trade sex for drugs, but also people steal. You know? Interpersonal violence, it increases that. You know? But these last 3 bullet points, I just see this over and over and over again. People that I'm working with, you know, they all suffer from depression and anxiety. And you can say, well, which is the chicken and which is the egg? I think a lot of drug use comes from self-medicating depression, self-medicating unresolved grief, self-medicating anxiety. That's how they get started. You know? But that, you know, the grief that people suffer from loss of family, loss of relationships, loss of, you know, their self-esteem, and the guilt they, every single person, they feel bad about themselves. They have this self-loathing that just, you know, doesn't help to get to a better place. And eventually they just lose all hope. They feel hopeless. And sometimes I think we as healers, as helpers, we feel the same hopelessness that they do. All right. Are you all depressed?
Yeah. And I have to say that the side effect of all that, not only the patient, but the providers are very affected by it.
Yeah, I'm going to say over 4 decades of medical practice, you know, it wasn't that this wasn't a problem years ago. There were plenty of people I used to see who were just mired in alcoholism. And I used to see a fair amount of drug use, but not like I do today. I've been at times just so cynical and so angry, and that does nothing but hurt. And the worst thing is I stop seeing this person as a person. I start seeing them as a cat, you know, and that's not a good place. So what I always try to tell myself is every one of these people, this is somebody's brother or sister or husband, wife or child, or, you know, this is a person. This is a person with a disease that's no different than any other disease. It has its set of symptoms, it has its physical consequences, it has its mental consequences, and it has treatment. All right. So I'm just going to say, you know, we have to own this as the medical profession. This was an iatrogenic epidemic to a large degree, but there were a lot of underlying causes that were already there. There's no single cause, but you know, it's a combination. I mean, you know, I told you, I think I'm an opiate addict, or I could be if I took some, because of genetics. You know, my brain is wired up. My immune receptors must be just really vigorous. You know, they want this stuff. By the way, for all my life, love to run. I wonder why. Running's not bad. Don't get me wrong. It's much healthier than injecting heroin. But you know, I think it does feed those same receptors, but in a good way. So it's okay. Keep running. But I think why is it that we use 2/3 of the world's supply of illicit drugs, even though we only have 4% of the population. I think a lot of it is social and economic, and it's attitude. We have a lot of, we have a lot of depression. We have a lot of anxiety. I mean, everybody does, the whole world does, but I think a lot of people end up self-medicating. And we do not, in this country that is, it's kind of myth that we're the wealthiest country in the world. It depends on how you measure that. We do have the largest economy in the world, but we also have a big population. So per capita GDP, we're still in the top 5. But anyway, despite that, we have this huge disparity in wealth. There are incredibly wealthy, and yet we have a large population of poverty stricken. That's just not right. Yes. Okay, I'm a socialist. But we really don't have. I'm talking countrywide, nationwide. We don't have good access to it. Just don't. This was a different family member who was a younger family member that started to kind of get into drugs. And we tried to, my wife and I were trying to help, guide the family to get her some treatment. It was really hard. This 18-year-old girl, it was hard to find a treatment program that she could do. Just didn't exist where she lived. But also, I think just this overall lack of knowledge, wisdom, I think we're regaining. There have been several. Is anybody familiar with the podcast Throughline? Anybody know that podcast? Okay. Yesterday, I confessed before all of you that I'm a science nerd. I'm also a history nerd. Throughline is a fascinating podcast. They take a current day situation and they'll go back in history and tell you how we got here. A couple of years ago, they did one about heroin in America, or opiates in general. But we've had several. Back in the late 1800s, we had a huge problem in this country with opium. Eventually led to the Harrison Act. That was kind of the first drug control act in the US back in the early 1900s. That helped, that kind of went away. There was another kind of epic wave in the 20s. There was another wave I talked about in the 60s, and now we're seeing another wave now. I actually take some comfort from that because these things come in waves, what goes up eventually goes down. Some of it's due to people dying from use, but a lot of it is us as a society coming to recognize that this stuff is poison. It's bad. Just don't do it. I mean, I think Nancy Reagan's Just Say No thing is a little naive, but still has a validness to it. It's if you never ever try opiates, you'll never get addicted. But I really think that the social disparities in this country, the disparity in wealth, disparities in opportunities, all of that really contribute to the problem that we have. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks for interrupting.
I'm sorry.
I'm sure I wanted to say.
That culture today, decade is a culture of gratification,
Absolutely.
and I feel good. And then the other piece is that's why I see is it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be anxious and feel stressed. And let's get into that and just delve into that and see what we can do. But it's okay to be uncomfortable. We all have uncomfortable moments and very trying times. But I feel like part of that is missing today. That it's just give me this pill because it's going to make this better. Give me this pill because this is going to make this better. Instead of really doing a deep dive into what is the issue.
Right.
And I agree with you. The social, economic, and the racism across the board is just so painful to, you see it every day and the effects on people.
You saw the slides that Dr. Null showed about the different levels of substance use disorder in different categories. Unfortunately, our people have the highest rate. Now, the good thing is, as Holly shared with us yesterday, we also have the highest rate of abstinence. Never see that slide. But I really think, is there any group in America that has suffered more injustice, racism, inequity as the Native population?
You mentioned, early on, you said the so-called illegal immigration, crisis. From our standpoint, is everybody an illegal?
Yeah. How many? 3 minutes? Good, because I'm almost finished. So I just want to leave you with these thoughts. Substance use disorder, it really robs people of their true selves, and it robs families of their true family. A little more self-disclosure. One of my brothers, well, my own brother, is an alcoholic. He finally got sober when he was 40 years old. And when he got sober, it was like, I had my brother back. He had been this, I grew up with him. We shared a room for 16 years. I knew him better than anybody else in the world. But in his 20s and 30s, it's like, I don't know who this is. And when he got sober, he came back. It was like he had died and suddenly rose from it. Yes.
Okay, so from your perspective as a practitioner and how do you think the introduction is relevant?
I think it's just one more thing. I don't think it's going to change the trajectory. Unless it feels much. I think it's just, it's like fentanyl, it's one more thing. We need give it something. But I don't think it's fundamentally different. But I really do. I think it's really important to concentrate on the second thing. Treatment failures, relapse, it's a part of the disease. And just because somebody relapses, that's not the end of the story, unless they overdose and die. But as long as they're still alive, there's still hope. And I have a hard time sometimes keeping that in mind, but it's true. Cynicism and despair and hopelessness are really, really easy responses. That's my natural response to this. It's a lot harder to make. It's a harder choice, but it's the right. So I would encourage you to try this. This is going to continue to be a problem for us as long as we don't address this inequity and racism and everything else. We got a lot more tools today. I mean, I don't think buprenorphine is a magic bullet, but I think medication-assisted treatment helps a lot of people. There is no magic bullet, but 12-step programs have been around for a long time. They're highly effective for some people. Buprenorphine is not effective for everybody, but it is for a lot of people. Methadone, which has a horrible reputation, still is effective for a lot of people. So we've got tools. I'm delighted to hear about these programs like Cherokee and Aquasasne that are doing things with the young people. Because, I really think an ounce of prevention is worth 100 pounds of cure. And I also just want to say, a lot of people get better. I told you about the guy that was really addicted, had a lot of problems, and yet he's now been drug-free for over a decade. By the way, he's worth a lot more money than I am. It's been a very successful business. Everybody that gets better is worth the effort. And if you can get one person to sobriety, you raise the whole health of the community because you take a lot of stress out of the family. You take a lot of stress out of, the other people around them. And that raises the health of the whole community. So it's really worth the effort. A lot of times we say, even the best treatment programs are expensive. They have only got a 30% cure rate. Well, as we get more and more people sober, it brings up the health of the whole community. And eventually it will. It's a rising tide, right? So it's all good. Harm reduction. You may not get the person to sobriety, but if you can prevent that endocarditis, and all the other infections, that's good. But I think what I want to leave you with is maintaining hope and a positive attitude. I'll tell you from 4 decades of experience. It's the thank you very much. No. Any other questions? Comments? I'd love.
So how long do you think, in your perspective, to revert it? It took what? 35 years to make the monster. How is it gonna be? 20 months? Like you said, you've got to stop the cycle.
Yeah.
Wait.
So